So leading us in the next portion of our presentation is Chris Adams, who is the Executive Director of Azusa Pacific University's Center for Vocational Ministry. He also serves as an MAS in the California Pacific Conference. Whoop, whoop. And then Vic Malloy is the Leadership Consultant for Jefferson Street Consulting and serves as an MAS in the Virginia Annual Conference. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for that smattering of applause. I appreciate that. I recently had the privilege of being invited to speak to all of the rural United Methodist pastors in North and South Carolina. And one of the pastors shared this wonderful story. He said that he was a brand new pastor just out of seminary at Duke in a rural Methodist church in North Carolina. And he quickly learned that being a rural Methodist pastor also means on-call farmhand. And so he got a phone call from a parishioner, said, "Pastor, I need your help." "Sure, what do you need?" "I need you to help me load my truck." And it was a board member, so he said, "Sure, no problem, I'll be right over." And so he goes over and finds himself loading bags of corn and bags of sugar onto this pickup truck and didn't think anything about it until he hopped in the truck and they drove way out into the middle of nowhere in the woods to this little shack that had this metal contraption inside the shack. And he realizes that he's complicit in bootleg moonshine at this point. But this guy's on his board, so what do you do? So a couple weeks go by and he came home to the parsonage, and behind, or by the back door of the parsonage were 2 mason jars full of clear liquid with a thank you note. So he took those inside, set them on the counter, and it just so happened that unannounced his district superintendent decided to stop by the parsonage that day. He came into the kitchen and he said, now that my district superintendent has now passed away, so I can tell this story now. She saw the mason jars on the counter, said, "What's with the mason jars?" And he told her the story, and she said, "Well, what are you going to do with them?" And he said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, can I have it?" And he said, "Sure." And he said, "I got a phone call a week later asking me if I could get some more." So I suppose that story begs questions about the 8-year health and effectiveness assessment or something, and all kinds of other questions. But pastors face all kinds of different concerns in different kinds of contexts, and the work that we all do is very contextual as well. Different states have different state laws, different conferences have different ways of doing things. What we're hoping to encourage you toward is to think about best practices, both in personnel selection and personnel psychology and clinical psychology, as well as in vocational discernment and clergy development. And to some extent, a lot of those best practices are going to cut across all contexts, but there will also be unique expressions of those. I should say I'd be remiss if I just didn't mention and honor a dear mentor and friend who, since our last quadrennial training, we lost. Dr. Richard Hunt was a mentor and dear friend, was my dissertation chair, and was one of the founding members of the Advisory Committee on Clergy Candidacy Assessment. And he shared with me before he passed that one of the deep joys for him was knowing that everyone in ministry in North America in the United Methodist Church had been through this process that he'd been a part of creating 40, 50 years ago. And so I just want to honor his memory today and thank God for Dr. Richard Hunt. And so with that, I really want to set up a conversation that I'll give you time to have, and then Dr. Malloy will come up and lead us in some further thoughts, and we'll give you more time for conversation, so that we want this to be more workshop than anything. But just to remind you of some of the important best practices in the larger field of personnel selection, the recommendation is to have a comprehensive process, because we're really thinking about whole person kind of assessment. And again, we've heard about this tension between for a both and of both selection as well as nurture, and that I would suggest it is possible to do both. We do have to think carefully about how to do that well, but having a comprehensive process in place and not just getting overly concerned with which tool are we going to use at the expense of thinking about the entire process, that the process is just as important, if not more important in some ways, than which tools that we use in a particular assessment. to define core competencies based on a job analysis is the recommendation in the field. We have those, the KSAPs, the knowledge, skills, abilities, personal characteristics that Dr. Rick Deshawn, who'll be sharing tomorrow, has identified through very rigorous and extremely well done research. We were discussing as a committee that our emphasis really is on the abilities and the personal characteristics part of the KSAPs. We don't know as much about the knowledge that people bring or have a way of assessing that fund of knowledge the way that a board of ministry or a local church does, or their skills, although we do get the observations through references, people observing them in real time. But there are a lot of implications, I think, that are really helpful from that list of KSAPs, and we'll be hearing more about that research tomorrow. Using multiple methods and instruments, we've already heard about that principle. We're looking at where different sources of information all converge to tell a story that we can, with some confidence, say we can come to these reasonable conclusions about a person. Using instruments that are relevant to the core competencies and instruments that have established reliability and validity. And this is what often distinguishes the more robust clinical assessment tools versus coaching kinds of tools. The coaching tools can still be enormously helpful in the hands of a really skilled coach, but they don't have what the MASs in the room would call the psychometric properties that are needed to really be an assessment tool. If you're not familiar, just quickly, reliability, there are multiple kinds. The two maybe that we talk most about in this context have to do with consistency. And so if you were to give a person the same instrument multiple times, would you get similar results? That's one form of reliability. Another form has to do with a particular scale on an instrument. Do the items on that scale sort of hang together to form a coherent scale? And that's another form of reliability. And the manuals that you get for these different instruments, they will have all the data on the reliability studies that were done prior to publishing an instrument. And then validity essentially is, are we measuring what we say that we're measuring? And that's also a really important thing to understand. It's also why the more sophisticated instruments like the MMPI that were mentioned have what are called validity scales that tell us as trained psychologists how a person essentially approaches taking the instrument. And that's one of the things that we want to consider. The less sophisticated instruments like the Myers-Briggs is the one I always pick on because it becomes, in my opinion, like a Christian horoscope in churches sometimes. It's so magical. How did it know me so well? Well, it's because you just told it to tell you that about yourself, because it's very easy to influence the results because it's not very sophisticated. Still can be very helpful in the hands of a trained coach or clinician. So we want to understand the difference between those two things. And what we decided we might do together starting today, and we won't finish it in this hour, is to glean from you questions, wisdom, so we can create a communal resource that would be ever growing and developing that will be available. So there's a document on the website that Meg just mentioned called Quick Reference Guide. It's an Excel spreadsheet that's an initial attempt to categorize the instruments that we understand are being used and to identify where in the process might those be helpful. Are they more clinical tools? Are they coaching tools? And then we have a whole set of categories listed there that we hope will be eventually a very user-friendly quick reference guide. For example, which ones have robust psychometric properties, which ones are available in multiple languages, which ones are available for online administration and scoring, those kinds of things where you could quickly peruse that and look at what are the other tools that might be available and get a sense of the quality of those and the purpose of those, that kind of thing. And that we might all construct that together in an ongoing kind of way. And so when we give you time in just a few minutes after I'm done, we'll want to invite you at your tables to talk about that. And there'll be an email address up where you can send some information about what other categories would you like to see on a quick reference guide like that, what other kinds of instruments are not included there that you're using or you know someone is using that you would like to see there as well. I like to make a distinction. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to mention this too. The original rationale for the the battery, that is the GBHEM battery, was at the time, the MMPI, the 16PF, those tools that we use were the state of the art in terms of research-based, psychometrically robust tools that were relevant to this kind of work. The field of psych assessment has grown and changed quite a bit since then, so there are other tools, but some important principles to keep in mind. You can Google Burroughs Institute. It's the folks that put out the Mental Measurement Yearbook, and if you have a question about a particular instrument, you can pay, it's not very expensive, it's like 10 or 15 bucks to get a very comprehensive expert analysis of a particular tool and what it's for, how well is it constructed, all those kinds of things, and that can be a helpful resource to you. Important in an intercultural church and world to think about fairness and minimizing bias, and sometimes or often it's very helpful to try to determine as best anyone can a candidate's level of acculturation and language proficiency in English prior to administration of instruments and scoring. Where possible, to administer instruments in their first language or their main language. Use cultural specific norms when that's possible, in order to avoid as much as we can the kind of thing we were discussing earlier where cultural differences can come up and we're not sure if it's a psychological issue or a cultural issue. And sometimes it's not possible the tests don't exist in a given language and there are no cultural norms, and so we do the best we can in those scenarios, and the test results become even more tentative in those kinds of situations, and we look to other kinds of information that we have, as Dr. Comer was suggesting, like work history and the references and those kinds of things. But trying to eliminate bias as much as we can by being mindful of those considerations. And then there's a distinction in personnel psych literature between screening out and screening in, and this is the very tension we've been talking about between selection and nurturing. There was some research done with MMPI profiles of United Methodist clergy candidates, and the basic conclusion of that was that the vast majority of candidates are fairly healthy folks, fairly well adjusted, not that they don't have issues that might even benefit from therapy for a little bit, but they didn't have any of the kinds of high risk factors that would mean one of us would say it would not be a good idea for them to continue. There certainly are those folks, but that's a small group of folks. Still important to screen out psychopathology, major psychopathology. We shouldn't stop doing that. But what I want to suggest to you is what we don't know is how many people are self-selecting out of this process to begin with. In other words, they never even try because this process is in place. I've been a part of consulting with denominations who look at what the United Methodist Church does and say, oh, we want to do something like that, help us put that in place. And as we put that in place, all of a sudden, there are lots of candidates that say, never mind, I'm not even going to go through this in this denomination anymore. And in most cases, that's actually a good thing. Now, they may go get ordained online in 5 minutes and start a church somewhere on their own, who knows. So all that to say, the majority of candidates that come through are likely going to be fairly healthy folks. And so, which leads us to think more about the nurture side of it, the leadership development side, the screening in. How do we help folks move toward next steps that make sense for them in their personal and professional development and support them in that? How do we develop them toward where God is calling them in helpful kinds of ways, which underscores the importance of the mentoring and coaching and everything that happens after some form of feedback happens, whether the candidates directly get the report or not, being able to fold that into some kind of development process would be my own personal bias as important, given the fact that most of the candidates that come through are going to be typically screened in. And that may vary by conference, it may vary by how much a given district is able to say no when that needs to be said. When we do need to say no, we look at the behavioral health guidelines, which again, I want to reference. Those were mentioned before. You can see the purpose there of those. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of additions that have been made recently. We try to revise those every so often. And so there are some revised and added sections on financial responsibility, anxiety and depression, and sexual misconduct, in particular sexual harassment and pornography use. Those have been changed, and so would draw your attention especially to those as you look through those behavioral health guidelines. And so with that, I would like to invite you to just discuss at your tables these kinds of questions. What are you already using? What's the process look like? What are the individual tools you're using in your assessment battery? What would you like to consider implementing in the future, both in terms of process and tools? We would love for you to email us what you're doing. And Meg, you might have to give us the email address. I thought it would be up here, and I don't think it's there.
It's
assessment@gbhem.org. assessment@gbhem.org. Please send us, if you look at the document that's already on the website, it's the quick reference guide Excel spreadsheet. You look at the categories there, the tools that are listed there in various columns, what's missing, how would you like to see that organized differently in a way that you would have access as a board of ministry person or an MAS to look at that and see, here are the list of tools that everybody's using across the country and what they're used for, the ones that are more coaching kinds of tools versus clinical kinds of tools that are a bit more robust psychometrically, both for candidacy process, perhaps as well as the 8-year assessment, which we'll talk more about perhaps tomorrow with Rick, Deshawn, and Meg. We'd love to hear from you and just know what's missing there. How can we co-create, socially construct a really helpful, user-friendly, quick reference guide that would benefit everybody, that would extend way beyond the required GBHEM battery, just to give you some other suggestions and tips on other resources you might think about using. Does that make sense? So we'll give you about 15 minutes or so to discuss at tables, and then Dr. Vic Molloy will come up and take it from there. And then we'll do questions and answers for both our presentations at the very end. So if you have questions, I'll ask you to hold those for now. But love to invite you to discuss at your tables what you're using and what you'd like to use, and please let us know what that is so we can build this resource together. Thank you. All right, well, let me invite your attention back up this way, if you would. And again, the email address is assessment@gbhem.org. Assessment@gbhem.org. We really do want your best thinking about process, about instruments, tools. How do we help conferences, both boards of ministry as well as MASs, know what are some of the state-of-the-art tools that might be helpful in different categories for different purposes at different points in the process. So that's a really handy reference guide for you to be able to look to if somebody on your conference says, hey, we think we should use the Enneagram to screen out people with psychopathology. You can, in an informed way, say, well, that's not that kind of tool because it's this kind of tool and this is what it's used for. That kind of thing to help people understand and make sure that's clear to all of us as well. So we're going to shift and in some ways talk a lot about the nurture side of things. And Dr. Vic Molloy, who is a leadership consultant with Jefferson Street Consulting, is going to come and lead us through that time. So Vic, would you welcome Dr. Vic Molloy?
Thank you, Chris. I was thinking last hour as we were talking about the variety of things we were talking about, that when a candidate sits in my office for the interview, I find myself almost always thinking, this is someone who's going to be in ministry for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I find myself thinking about the arc of their ministry and two things. Are they likely to be harmful to the church? Or is the church likely to be harmful to them in terms of their personality structure? So I keep those two things in focus. And then as I think about the arc of their ministry, and as I was doing that a while ago, I thought about Meg's inference this morning that we have kind of these 2 points in our church where we say, congratulations, you're in, congratulations on your retirement. And that leaves a lot of space in between for nurturance in ministry, for, you heard Meg talk about the stage of full membership as being the focus for effectiveness. And effectiveness in ideal circumstances is not stagnant, but should be dynamic, and we should be growing and changing throughout the course of our careers. And let's see where we need to go here. If you would move the slides up, please. And the next one. Back up. Well, we'll find it here in a second. Back. Okay, that's good. That's where I want to be. So what I want to talk about in terms of nurture is thinking with you about leadership assessment and intervention throughout the career path of those of us who are clergy. I've spent the last decade and a half coaching leaders in a variety of professions, including senior leaders in a variety of professions and including those in ministry all along their career path. And the most striking thing that I've noticed is how consistently across all professions, persons are placed in leadership positions and not provided with basic leadership resources to enable them to carry out their responsibilities effectively and efficiently and to grow as leaders. And I see it time and again, over and over in all professions across the board, and no less so within our church. The result is that whether a leader turns out to be a good leader or an average leader or a poor leader is pretty much the flip of a coin, 50-50. Generally, if a person turns out to be a pretty good leader, it's usually because of innate personality characteristics, and often even good leaders don't become excellent leaders because they're not properly resourced along the career path. Positive personality characteristics, another way to say that, is positive personality characteristics will only carry one so far as a leader, and generally not the distance. More than 4 decades ago, Peter Drucker gave us the concept of the Peter Principle, you may remember, popularized as rising in an organization to one's level of incompetence. And you might think about some folks who may have done that. A better way to think about that concept is that the leadership skills that bring one to a certain level of responsibility will not take one creatively and effectively to the next level of responsibility. That is, what most leaders do when confronted with increased levels of responsibility and challenge is to try and do more of what got them there in the first place. And that usually is not efficient for quantum levels of increased responsibility, and it also limits their growth as leaders. That is usually referred to as making technical change, that is, doing more of the same things as a leader. Instead, what we know from leadership research that's needed at those points of significant increased leadership responsibility is adaptive change. That is, the ability to use novel and unfamiliar leadership approaches, and that almost can never be done alone. It almost always needs to be done in concert with other people who act as guides, if you will. There's research that documents that up to 67% of all leaders, including the most successful, derail at some point in their careers, and that derailment may be acting out, but also it may simply not be living up to their potential. And when they do derail, it's almost always related to a lack of adaptive change, which is heavily dependent on honest and consistent feedback that leads to increased self-awareness. A dear colleague of mine, seminary professor in pastoral theology, used to say that the trouble with most of us is no one's cared enough about us to tell us the truth about ourselves. And usually, the higher one moves in an organization, the less honest feedback they receive. And it is here that the importance of leadership assessment throughout the career path becomes important. Leadership assessment is a critical resource in helping a leader discover her or his strengths and weaknesses and to develop strategies for attending to those strengths and weaknesses. And for those strategies to be effective, they must always involve ongoing dialogue with someone more senior and experienced, such as a mentor, a leadership coach, a supervisor, a leadership program. Rarely can it adequately be done with a peer. And for leadership change to be sustainable, that kind of engagement around change with a mentor, a leadership coach, or supervisor should be 1 to 3 years in length to create sustainability, because we know we can get a peak of change with many, many different kinds of programs, from a weekend retreat to an MBA program to what have you. But to get sustainability of change requires a lot of hard work over time and a lot of consistent feedback. So given that, I want to talk first about some leadership assessment instruments and then talk about interventions or follow-up, if you will. These suggestions are based on my bias that 360 assessments that are valid and reliable are more useful than assessments that use only self-report data. A great deal of the benefit of a 360 assessment is being able to see and explore the gaps between self-perception and other perception. And that's really where often the coaching work, the mentoring work is where there are these gaps between how I view myself as the most sensitive and empathic person in the world and my 15 colleagues that I've asked to rate me all say not so much. So this list of 5 instruments is in no way comprehensive, but it is a list of 360 instruments with which I'm familiar that provide sound data on leadership. And we'll provide an opportunity after this to do some table dialogue and then some Q&A. So the first one of these I want to talk about is the EM 360. That you'll hear much more about from Rick Deshawn and Meg tomorrow morning. But in a word, it's the competencies that are rated come right out of the now, I suppose, close to 14 years of research on the KSAPs of knowledge, skills, abilities, and personal characteristics. And that allows one to both self-report and also be reported on by those in one's sphere of influence, if you will. The second one is the Berkman 360 multi-rater, and there the competencies rated have to do with leadership that communicates an ability to ensure long-term results, which has to do with follow-through, the capacity to lead others, the capacity to build, to engage in teamwork and build strong teams, the capacity to manage outcomes, the capacity to delegate to others and not have to do it all oneself, the capacity to develop others, the capacity to make decisions, and by that crisp decisions, firm decisions after enough input, the capacity to deal with conflicting ideas, and the capacity for personal and professional growth. And then the Leadership Circle 360, that's a favorite of mine. I use it a great deal. I've been using it for 12 years now from the Leadership Circle. And it looks at 2 things in terms of competencies rated. It looks at creative competencies, which, if you imagine a circle, when you get the results of a 360, you get a big circle, and the top half of the circle is creative competencies. That is, the things that we know that are very important in leadership. And the top half of that circle is divided in half. And on the left half, it has to do with relationships, and the right half has to do with tasks, the ability to accomplish tasks. We know that the very best leaders are able to have a good balance between maintaining relationships and carrying out tasks. The beauty of this instrument is that it also has a bottom half to the circle, and the bottom half is has to do with our reactive tendencies. That is, the things that we do, the things that I may do that get in the way of my creative competencies on the top side. So, as an example, am I too compliant to really get tasks accomplished? Am I too protecting and distant and non-transparent with the data that I'm working with my team or my organization? Or am I controlling? Do I have a tendency to stand over people and micromanage? And we know that those three components, overdone, become obstacles to a leader's success in whatever the leadership arena is. And then I want to talk about two 360 emotional intelligence instruments, because there's a growing body of research that indicates that as much as 58% of positive performance in all types of jobs is dependent on, is highly correlated with emotional intelligence, twice the correlation as IQ. So we know that if you think about, again, the sheet that Meg passed out this morning that showed the attributes, and we know that a person can be very bright, very, very bright, but if they don't have good interpersonal competencies or emotional intelligence, then it doesn't matter how high their IQ is, they're going to have dilemmas in leading teams. And so the first of these I want to talk about is the Bar on Emotional Quotient Inventory, or the EQI. It's a 360 emotional intelligence test. And those competencies look at self-perception, the interpersonal capacity that the person has, the way in which they go about making decisions, their capacity for self-expression, and that has to do with self-regulation as well as other regulation, and how well they manage stress in their lives. The other one is the ESCI, Emotional and Social Competency Inventory, and those competencies that are rated there have to do with emotional self-awareness, adaptability, positive outlook on life, the capacity for empathy, organizational awareness, the capacity to coach and mentor others, the inspirational leadership, the capacity to cast a vision and to help people follow that vision, the capacity to influence as a leader and not just drive decisions, but to influence others for buy-in, the ability to manage conflict, and the ability to engage in good teamwork, if you will. So those are the five that I want to place before you. And then I want to say this about follow-up and intervention, that generally assessment without follow-up and intervention is often useless and at times destructive. And so you always want to have some form of intervention and follow-up tied to any assessment that you use. It should involve debriefing with someone skilled with the particular assessment being used. It should involve goal setting, should involve an action plan, should involve a timeline and some ongoing accountability, again, thinking in terms of a 1 to 3 year process that you're working on, whatever the strengths and the weaknesses are that are yielded by any of these instruments or others that you may use. Again, best done with a senior person with more experience. And then a final word, and that is, who are the best candidates for leadership assessment and resourcing? And here's what we know from leadership research on return on investment, that is, bang for the buck, if you will. and that is the highest return on assessment and intervention is people who are already high performers. That if you're able to leverage their strengths to an even higher level, then you get a much greater impact on their leadership, and for the sake of our discussion, on their capacity for ministry, than the others that I'll talk about in a minute. So the mid-level return, the research shows, is the highest, is the next highest, which is for people who are in the first year of a new job. Doesn't mean they're starting in their career, but the first year of a new job. And examples of that would be someone perhaps moving from a small church to a medium church, from a medium church to a large church, from a rural church to an urban church, from being a pastor to being a district superintendent, from being a pastor to going on conference staff or general church staff, for those being elected to the episcopacy. All of those are jumps in the amount of responsibility that's going to call for adaptive leadership and not just the technical leadership that you can just do more of what got you there. And so that's where the importance of strategizing and getting both a leadership assessment and then follow-up in terms of whatever kinds of resourcing the person may need. What we know is that in the business world in general, and for those of us in the church, we tend to spend 80% of our personnel resources on the 10 to 20% of the underperformers, when stewardship-wise, the research tells us it should be the opposite. So you can see from the chart up there that the lower level return is on average performers, and the lowest level of return is on underperformers. And again, businesses tend to put 80% of their personnel resources in that 10 to 20% of underperformers. You get very little return on investment. Where the investment really needs to be is in high potential, high performers. And thus, anyone moving into these increased levels of responsibility become really good candidates for a leadership assessment and then for some kind of resourcing related to that. So what I'm interested in now is if you would, at your tables, describe to one another in your conference how you go about assessing leadership and what are the particular instruments that you use to do that. So take about 15 minutes to have that conversation. Do you have a way of assessing leadership? If so, what is it? And if you're using instruments, what are the instruments that you may be using? And let's see, if we could hear very quickly, using the microphones from any things that came up at your table in terms of what are you, how are you resourcing leadership issues? Are there other leadership instruments that you're using? So we're going to take about 3 or 4 minutes right now and hear from your tables in terms of whatever may have come up. And if you would use a mic to do that. And we heard from a table I was sitting at an example of a conference having spent probably $200,000 on an underperformer over the course of some time. And sitting there listening to that, I thought, wow, if you put that $200,000 to work on a high performer or several high performers, how much more bang for the buck would you get? What things came up at your tables? Tell us. Other instruments you may be using. Could you use the mic, please? Thank you.
My name is Glenn. I'm from Upper New York. We talked a little bit about the LPLI. Not sure if anyone has looked at. We just made that mandated that by the end of November, all clergy need to have taken that. We're still in the process trying to figure out what we're going to do with that information, but hopefully maybe we'll use it as a springboard into the 8-year evaluation. So we're
Terrific,
looking
great,
at-
good, thank you. And you're using it also? Great, great.
Just a comment about the LPLI, which I think is was created by clergy, which is helpful in a very similar way to what Rick Deschamps will describe tomorrow. Just to contrast, the EM360 has a lot more rigor in the methodology that was used to create it and in the psychometrics behind it, the validity and reliability, than the LPLI does. So it's not that the LPLI can't be useful, but it's not as rigorous as the tools that Vic has described, nor as rigorous as what Rick Deschamps will describe tomorrow. So I just want to make that quick distinction.
Thanks, Chris. That's very helpful. And Chris was also reminding me that he and I had a conversation a while back that another important time to resource a leader is in their transition time toward the end of a career or toward the end of a job, that folks become very vulnerable at the point at which they're kind of winding down, if you will, in the last year or 2 years, and that can become another very important point in a career for coaching as well, and assessment. Behind me, you'll see Parker Palmer's quote about why the work of leadership formation is so important to be done in community. As he writes, the journey toward inner truth is too taxing to be made solo. Lacking support, the solitary traveler soon becomes weary or fearful and is likely to quit the road. The path is too deeply hidden to be traveled without company, which is where a 360 comes in. Finding our way involves clues that are subtle and sometimes misleading, requiring the kind of discernment that can happen only in dialogue. The destination is too daunting to be achieved alone. We need community to find the courage to venture into the alien lands to which the inner teacher may call us. Parker Palmer.
We're going to move to a break here in just a moment before Floyd comes up and clears up any legal confusion that might still be in the room. So we'll look forward to Floyd doing that. But any final comments, questions about even my portion of what's been shared before we do that you think the whole room would benefit from, a question or a comment? Again, we really do solicit your input through assessment@gbhem.org, assessment@gbhem.org. Please submit tools that you found helpful, other categories for that quick reference guide you think would be helpful to have there, where we can sort of evaluate in a communal way what are the best tools for different purposes. And as you're making decisions about cost effectiveness and the length of the battery you're using and all those kinds of things, then it can be helpful to have something like that. But, yeah, Doug.
Doug McCown, Samaritan Counseling Center, MAS, CalPAC. I was sharing at my table, one of the ways I look at this process is as a developmental process. And so, whatever tool or whatever feedback mechanism has to be appropriate for where that person is at that point in time. And so early on, the feedback and what we provide, or what assessment tool or measure we use, might not be as sophisticated and as comprehensive as something on down the line, but at least it provides a launching point for that developmental level right there. The hope would be that they are that they get in connection with a mentor so that that process further unfolds in their developmental process. That would be the hope.
Yeah, I could not agree more, and not just because I work for Doug at the Samaritan Center, but I absolutely agree with that. And Vic, there might be a question in there. Given the importance of self-awareness, is a 362 something, is it too soon in a candidacy process to use something like that? Or how far along the journey should someone be before they engage in a developmental tool like that?
First of all, I just want to echo agreement with what you just said, that that from my perspective, anything that gets a foot in the door is a good place to start. I'm thinking about the EQ 2.0 book, and there's a quick and dirty online EQ test that you can take, totally unreliable and invalid, but very useful for getting a conversation started. If a person is open to at least taking that kind of shallow look at what the instrument has to say about them, that's a start and a step down the road that wouldn't be there otherwise. So I'm kind of shameless in that way in terms of being able to use anything that will work. The dilemma with the 360 at the candidacy level is, well, let me ask this question. Are there those of you using a 360 at the candidacy level in your conference? Hands, could you speak to what you're using?
We just started with the EM360. It is brand new, and we decided to kind of start that with the provisional.
And Meg, you're thinking about morphing the EM360 toward candidacy?
I can speak to that. You asked the question about the 360. If you are using GBHEM's personal reference form process, that is a 360. On the personal reference forms, the same questions are answered by the candidate and by the references that the candidate selects. So yes, we are looking at how we can update our personal reference form to reflect some of these attributes that our EM360 research has pointed to helping to determine effectiveness in ministry, and that's in development right now. We'll talk about that tomorrow.
Generally, though, it seems to me that using, say, the Leadership Circle 360 profile, that at the candidacy level, I don't know whether you're going to get enough, whether that person has the breadth of employment experience to really make good use of that instrument. You really want the person in a work context for at least a year to then be able to reach out and get legitimate feedback from colleagues and coworkers and that sort of thing, seems to me. Yes, please.
I'd like to ask a question about the MMPI, if I can, related to GBHEM. We use that in the Mississippi Conference, and I'm not familiar if we're paying a fee for that or if that's a service of GBHEM. And then second question is, we get the MMPI-2. Is there a chance that that could be the MMPI-2 RF or the latest version?
We have had extensive debate on the Psych Assessment Committee about the 2 versus the RF, and I believe, and right now the committee's decided to continue recommending the 2, but I'm tossing this out to the committee that we're getting another question here about should we switch to using the RF as part of our standard battery. Just because the way our system is set up right now, we need to have a standard battery. It's hard, we can't do a catalog, but we are looking to how can we make that more flexible for conferences. It's just not worked out technically yet. When candidates enroll in UMCARES, the standard candidacy fee is $45 if your conference does not use our candidacy office for psychological assessment. If your office uses us, we add $30 to the cost of the candidacy fee, which basically covers the administration of the MMPI-2 and the 16PF. So there's just a bump up there. Our only service is to actually score the test and get the data back to the MAS. And then there's an additional fee for the conferences to contract with the MAS to prepare the report. So that's kind of how that all breaks out. Yeah.
Sure. It might shock you to know that there's not always total agreement on the assessment committee about these matters. Any of you that have been on a committee for anything won't be surprised by that. The debate between the MPI-2 and the RF is there some stuff that gets lost in the RF that might be germane to this particular kind of assessment, and so that's the thing to consider. The question has also came up at my table and other places in the room about the different kinds of reports you can get. There are different reports you can get for the MMPI or the 16PF, including one for the MMPI that's a seminary student version or an occupational type of report. And those can be helpful. I think on the CalPAC conference, we have such enormous diversity that often the general clinical norms are the best choice because of the particular kind of candidate. But sometimes there are other reports that we only have one available through GBHEM, but you might want to consider getting a different report that might give you a little bit of a different look, assuming that the reference group, the norm group, is appropriate for that particular candidate. And so those are all the kinds of interpretation decisions that MASs have to make based on what reports are available on different norm groups and so forth. That's a clinical decision that we make on a case-by-case basis.
Other comments or questions? Then thank you for your attentiveness, Meg.
Yeah. Thank you, Vic. Thank you, Chris.